That is exactly how I feel too. That's what Princess Margaret said, quietly, in the red drawing room at Windsor Castle, the day Peter Townsend finally told her the truth about what he felt for her. The rest of the household was in London. Nobody else was there to hear it. He was a war hero, married, 15 years her senior, and the king's own equerry. She was third in line to the throne, and for years, the two of them managed to keep that conversation a secret, right up until the whole country convinced itself it remembered every detail. Townsend would later call what happened between them the thing that changed the entire shape of his life. Margaret would spend the next 50 years fielding questions about it she never quite managed to close. Here's what most people think they know. Princess Margaret chose duty over love, and that was that. Clean, simple. The end of the story. It wasn't. There's a letter in the National Archives, written in Margaret's own hand, that her own biographer says completely changes how that ending should be read. If you're the kind of person who wants the real story, told properly, with the facts it deserves, subscribe now and stick around till the end. This one turns on that letter, because what that choice actually held was a lot stranger and a lot sadder than the fairy tale Britain's been repeating for 70 years. Before we get into it, if you're new here, hit subscribe. These are the stories the official record likes to smooth over, and this channel tells them the way they actually happened. And if this is the kind of story you love, drop a like. It costs you 2 seconds, and it's the only reason channels like this stay alive. Here's the story you've probably heard before. Princess Margaret gave up the only man she ever really loved, purely out of duty, because the church and the crown left her no real choice. Clean sacrifice, no second guessing. That's the version Britain's repeated for 70 years. It's not what the paperwork says. In 2004, the National Archives at Kew declassified a set of government files from 1955, and what's inside them doesn't match the fairy tale. Prime Minister Anthony Eden's government, working with the Queen herself, had actually drawn up a real plan. Margaret could marry Peter Townsend. She could keep her royal title. She could keep her income from the civil list. All she had to give up was her own place and her children's place in the line of succession. That offer existed, on paper, in writing. Then there's the letter. In August of 1955, 2 months before she made her decision public, Margaret wrote to Eden herself. In her own hand, she told him she needed to see Townsend in person before she could make up her mind. It is only by seeing him that I feel I can properly decide whether she could marry him or not. 2 months before the announcement, she still hadn't decided. Christopher Warwick, Margaret's own authorized biographer, the man she sat down with, the man her closest circle trusted, has said flatly that this letter rewrites history. It doesn't prove she wanted out. It doesn't prove she was forced into anything. What it proves is that the story is a lot less settled than anyone's ever told you. So which is it? A woman who'd made peace with duty long before she said so out loud, or a woman still genuinely torn right up until the very end? Nobody's ever been able to prove it either way, and by the time this story's over, you might not be able to either. But to understand how she ended up writing that letter, you have to go back a lot further than 1955. You have to go back to a 6-year-old girl who was never supposed to matter this much. She was 6 years old in December of 1936, and she didn't understand yet what had just happened to her life. Nobody explained it to her properly, not really. One day her uncle was king. The next day he wasn't, and her father was standing in his place instead, looking like a man who'd been handed a job he never once asked for. Margaret was too young to follow the constitutional details, but she understood the shape of it. She understood that something had shifted, and that it hadn't shifted for her. Born on the 21st of August 1930 at Glamis Castle in Scotland, Margaret arrived the old-fashioned way, with a government minister standing by to confirm the birth was genuine. The Home Secretary at the time, J.R. Clines, made the journey up from London for exactly that reason, a formality left over from centuries of royal paranoia about substituted babies. It's a strange detail to attach to a newborn, but it says something about the world Margaret was born into before she'd taken a single breath in it. Even her arrival belonged, in part, to the state. For the first 6 years of her life, though, none of that weighed on her much. She and her sister Elizabeth, Lilibet, as the family called her, lived a childhood that looked, from the inside, almost ordinary. Their home was 145 Piccadilly, a townhouse rather than a palace, with a governess named Marion Crawford who took them on walks through Hyde Park and let them ride the escalators at the tube station like it was the most exciting thing in the world, because to 2 young girls, it was. Elizabeth was the elder by 4 years, and in the family Margaret was born into, that was supposed to be the only fact that mattered. Elizabeth was the one who mattered constitutionally. Margaret was the spare, a word nobody used out loud in front of a child, but one she'd have understood the meaning of long before she understood the word itself. That arrangement worked fine. It was almost comfortable. Being the second daughter of a duke who wasn't expected to be king meant Margaret got something her sister never really had: room to be ordinary. She could be funny, she could be difficult, she could throw a tantrum at breakfast, and nobody treated it like a national event, because nothing about her was a national event yet. That freedom, small as it sounds, shaped her more than anyone around her seemed to notice at the time, and then her uncle fell in love with a woman the Church of England wouldn't accept, and gave up the throne to marry her anyway, and every bit of that room Margaret had been living in disappeared almost overnight. The family didn't just gain new titles, they moved house, out of 145 Piccadilly and into Buckingham Palace, a building neither girl had ever called home, with staff neither of them knew, and a scale of formality neither of them had grown up inside. Elizabeth began receiving the kind of constitutional education a future monarch needs. Margaret didn't. Nobody sat her down and explained why one sister was suddenly being tutored for a throne and the other wasn't. She was simply expected to understand it, the way children are so often expected to understand things adults never actually say out loud. Her father became King George VI, her sister became heir to the throne of the British Empire, and Margaret became something the family had never quite built a role for, the second daughter of a king now, but never, under any circumstance anyone could foresee, a queen herself. She'd spend the rest of her life just off to the side of the one place she'd never be allowed to stand. It's worth pausing on that, because it explains a great deal of what came later. Margaret didn't lose her father's affection in the move to Buckingham Palace. She lost her freedom from expectation. Before the abdication, nobody outside the household was watching her. After it, everybody was: reporters, historians, an entire public that would spend the rest of her life deciding what she should feel and how she should behave, without ever asking her either question. She found her comfort where she could. And mostly she found it in her father. By every account that survives from people who actually watched the two of them together, George VI adored his younger daughter in a way that was almost uncomplicated. Rare, for a man who spent most of his adult life being anything but uncomplicated. He'd been a shy, stammering second son himself once, a man thrust into a throne he never wanted and never trained for. Maybe that's part of why he understood Margaret instinctively, in a way he never quite managed with the daughter who was about to inherit everything he'd been handed against his will. He spoiled her. He laughed at her jokes. He let her get away with things the household staff quietly rolled their eyes at. Her mother, by contrast, wasn't cold or distant in any dramatic sense, just less naturally close to her. The bond that mattered most to young Margaret ran through her father, and it ran deep. Which meant that when he died in February of 1952, at just 56 years old, Margaret didn't only lose a parent, she lost the one person in her family who'd made her feel like she counted on her own terms, and not just as a footnote to somebody else's future. She was 21 years old. And in the vacuum that death left behind, in the year that followed it, she was about to lean on somebody else entirely, a man who'd already been standing quietly at the edges of her family's life for years by then, who was about to comfort her through the worst grief she'd ever known, and who was about to become the center of a story the entire country would spend 2 years fighting over. Nobody in that grieving household had any idea what they'd just set in motion. In February of 1947, the royal family boarded a ship for a 3-month tour of South Africa, and among the staff assigned to travel with them was a 32-year-old RAF pilot named Peter Townsend. He wasn't there because of Margaret. He was there because of the king. Townsend had flown fighters in the Battle of Britain, shot down enemy aircraft, survived a war that killed most of the men who'd trained alongside him, and somewhere along the way he'd caught the attention of Buckingham Palace. By 1944, he was serving as an equerry to King George VI, one of the men whose job was simply to be near the monarch, to manage the small, constant logistics of royal life. He was married, with 2 young sons. None of that had anything to do with the 17-year-old princess he was about to spend 3 months traveling alongside. South Africa changed that. The tour itself was grueling in ways most people never picture when they imagine royal travel. Long days in unbearable heat, endless official functions, thousands of miles covered by train through landscape that swallowed the horizon whole. But somewhere inside all that formality, There was time that belonged to no one but the people living it, and one of the ways the royal family filled it was on horseback. Margaret rode most mornings, and Townsend, whose duties included looking after the details of royal life that nobody else thought to manage, often rode with her. Years later, by one account passed down through someone close to her, Margaret described those mornings simply. "We rode together every morning in that wonderful country, in marvelous weather," she reportedly told a confidant. "That's when I really fell in love with him." It's worth being honest about what that quote is and isn't. It's a remembered remark, not a document. The kind of thing that survives because someone she trusted repeated it faithfully, rather than because it was written down at the time. But it matches everything else that's known about that trip, and it matches what came after it. So it's held here for what it is, not proof, but a strong echo of something real. What made it complicated wasn't the writing, it was everything Townsend represented that a 17-year-old girl, however sharp and however observant, might not have fully weighed at the time. He was married. He was 15 years older than she was. He'd already lived an entire adult life, a war, a marriage, 2 children, before she'd finished being a teenager. None of that stopped whatever was happening between them on those morning rides. It just meant that whatever was happening had nowhere safe to go. There's a temptation, telling stories like this, to skip straight to the scandal, to jump from the meeting to the headlines, as if nothing mattered in between. But that skips the part that actually explains everything else. Before there was ever a public crisis, there was a friendship built slowly, out of proximity and shared mornings, and the specific kind of intimacy that grows between two people who spend a war-weary, sun-scorched tour watching out for each other in small, unremarkable ways. Townsend wasn't a stranger who swept in. He was already there, steady, present, competent at the kind of quiet care that royal life rarely offers a teenage girl who's just watched her family's entire world get rearranged by an abdication she never asked for. That mattered. Margaret had spent the previous decade learning that her role in her own family was to stand slightly outside the center of things. Townsend, whatever else he was, paid attention to her the way people pay attention to someone who matters entirely on her own terms, not as the spare, not as the sister of the future queen, but as herself. It's not hard to understand why that would take hold of a 17-year-old and not let go. None of it went anywhere yet. That's the part worth sitting with. When the tour ended and the royal family sailed home, Townsend went back to his wife and his sons and his post at the palace, and Margaret went back to being a teenage princess with a full calendar and a family that had no idea what those mornings in South Africa had actually planted. On paper, nothing had happened. No one could have pointed to a single moment and called it improper. A princess and an equerry had ridden horses together on a royal tour. That was all. But her father was still alive. Townsend was still married. And whatever had started between them on those rides was still nothing more than a feeling neither of them had said out loud. That was about to stop being true. And when it did, it wouldn't be a quiet, private thing anymore. It would be a story the entire country got to have an opinion about. On the morning of February 6, 1952, King George VI was found dead in his bed at Sandringham. He was 56 years old. The day before, by every account, had been ordinary. He'd walked the estate, gone out shooting hares in the cold winter air, and seemed, if anything, in better spirits than he had been in months. He went to bed that night and simply never woke up. A heart that had been quietly failing him for years, weakened by illness the public had never been told the full truth about, finally gave out in his sleep. The news took hours to reach the people who needed it most. Elizabeth, the new queen the moment her father died, though she didn't yet know it, was thousands of miles away in Kenya, partway through a royal tour, staying at a lodge called Treetops, when the telegram finally caught up with her. She flew home a queen, having left Britain a princess. And back in London, in a household still arranging flowers for a king who was no longer alive to see them, Margaret was left to grieve the one parent who'd always made her feel like she mattered on her own terms, not as anyone's shadow. It's in that fog of loss that Peter Townsend's place in her life quietly deepened. He'd been part of her father's staff for years already, one of the steady, familiar faces of a household in mourning. In the reshuffling that follows any death of a monarch, he was appointed equerry to the new queen, which meant that instead of stepping back, he stepped further in, staying inside the family's daily orbit at exactly the moment its youngest daughter needed someone steady the most. He organized her diary. He escorted her to functions her sister no longer had time to attend personally. He became, in the months after the funeral, one of the few constants in a life that had just lost its center. That same year, his own life quietly came apart in a different way. In December of 1952, Townsend's marriage to his wife Rosemary formally ended in divorce. The grounds cited were her adultery with a man named John de Laszlo, the son of a well-known society portrait painter, and under the legal language of the time that made Townsend the innocent party. It mattered, in 1950s Britain, exactly how a marriage ended and whose fault a court decided it was. Being the wronged party in a divorce carried a different social weight than being the one who'd caused it. Townsend walked out of that courtroom with custody of his 2 young sons and a reputation, at least on paper, that hadn't been damaged by what happened. He hadn't sought the divorce. He hadn't chased anyone else. But he was, as of December 1952, a free man, free in exactly the way that mattered for what came next, and free at precisely the moment his life had already become entangled with a princess of the realm. Not long after, in the spring of 1953, he did something that changed the entire shape of the story. He asked Margaret to marry him. She said yes. That's the moment this stops being a private matter between 2 grieving, devoted people and becomes something else entirely, a constitutional one, with lawyers and clergymen and a prime minister about to get involved in a decision that, on the surface, should have belonged to nobody but the 2 of them. Here's what it actually meant. Stripped of any softening the palace might have preferred, under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, no descendant of King George II under the age of 25 could marry without the sovereign's formal consent. Margaret was 22, which meant the single most important decision of her life wasn't legally hers to make alone. It belonged to her sister, who was no longer just her sister anymore, but the reigning queen, and, as Supreme Governor of the Church of England, the head of an institution that did not, under its teaching at the time, recognize the remarriage of a divorced person while a former spouse was still living. It didn't matter that Townsend had been the wronged party in his own divorce. To the church, divorced was divorced. Elizabeth didn't have to answer straight away. Under the law, the request could sit. There was no ticking clock written into the statute itself, no deadline forcing an immediate response. For the moment, in the spring and early summer of 1953, this remained a family matter, a quiet, difficult conversation happening behind closed doors, between a new queen barely out of her 20s and a younger sister asking her to choose between the rules Elizabeth had just sworn to uphold and the happiness of the person she'd grown up beside. But a family that the entire world is already watching doesn't get to keep its conversations quiet for long. Elizabeth's coronation was just weeks away, a moment engineered, deliberately, to present the monarchy at its most composed, most dignified, most unshakable. Nobody around that family had any idea that the coronation itself was about to hand this private question to the entire country to answer instead. On the 2nd of June 1953, Elizabeth II was crowned Queen of England inside Westminster Abbey, in front of 8,000 guests, in a ceremony broadcast live on television for the very first time in the monarchy's history. Millions of people who had never once seen the inside of the Abbey watched it unfold on grainy black and white screens, in living rooms across the country and, for the first time, across the world. It was designed, down to the last detail, to project stability. A new queen, a new age, an institution steadying itself after the loss of a beloved king. Nobody in that abbey was thinking about Peter Townsend. He was staff that day, an equerry, present in an official capacity, one uniformed figure among dozens managing the vast, choreographed machinery of a coronation. He wasn't supposed to be a story. Then Princess Margaret reached over, in full view of the assembled press, and brushed a small piece of fluff from his uniform. It lasted less than a second. It was the kind of small, automatic gesture people make without thinking, for someone they're completely at ease with, the sort of thing you'd do for a brother, a close friend, anyone you weren't consciously aware of touching. Townsend himself, recalling the moment years later in conversation with the journalist Jean Rook, said neither of them thought anything of it at the time. "I never thought a thing about it, and neither did Margaret," he told her. But that little flick of her hand did it all right. After that, the storm broke. An American reporter, watching more closely than anyone realized, caught it. Within days, the image and the speculation wrapped around it had crossed the Atlantic, printed in newspapers thousands of miles from London before a single British paper had dared say a word. That's worth sitting with for a moment. a country's own press staying silent about a story its readers were already learning secondhand, from abroad, filtered back through foreign coverage of their own royal family. The British papers couldn't hold the line forever. On the 14th of June, less than 2 weeks after the coronation, the Sunday tabloid The People finally broke the silence at home, declaring it was time the public knew what was already being whispered on 2 continents. Even then, the paper hedged its own headline, insisting the story was, of course, utterly untrue, the kind of denial that manages to confirm exactly what it claims to deny. Behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace, what had been a quiet, private family conversation became something close to a constitutional emergency. Prime Minister Winston Churchill instructed his Attorney General to formally examine where the law actually stood. It's a strange, almost ironic detail of this story that Churchill was one of the very few senior figures who'd argued against forcing Edward VIII to abdicate back in 1936, the last time a member of this family had put personal love ahead of institutional expectation. 17 years later, he found himself on the opposite side of a nearly identical dilemma, this time working to make sure history didn't repeat itself. And the central obstacle wasn't any one person's personal objection, it was the Church of England itself, the institution the Queen now led as its supreme governor, which simply did not, under its doctrine at the time, recognize the remarriage of a divorced person while a former spouse still lived. It didn't matter that Townsend had been the wronged party in his own divorce, or that a court of law had said so plainly. To the Church, divorced was divorced, blameless or not. The response, when it finally came, was swift and almost surgical in how quietly it was carried out. That summer, Townsend was reassigned, not dismissed, not disgraced on any official record, simply posted abroad, to Brussels, to serve as air attaché at the British embassy there. It was the kind of solution that solves a problem without anyone ever having to admit out loud that there was one. Move the man 300 miles away, and the story, in theory, quiets down on its own. What it actually did was take a relationship that had survived a war, a royal tour, a king's death, and a divorce, and stretch it across a stretch of open water, reducing 2 people who'd spent years learning each other's company to an exchange of letters and rationed, occasional visits. Margaret stayed in London, inside a family now bracing itself for a decision none of them had wanted to make in public. Townsend settled into a new post in a new country, waiting for a resolution that nobody with any real power seemed to be in any hurry to give him. 2 years now stood between them. Neither of them yet knew whether 2 years was simply a pause, the kind of gap 2 people genuinely in love find a way to wait out, or whether it was the quiet, deliberate beginning of an ending that neither of them had chosen for themselves. For 2 years, the only version of Peter Townsend most of Britain knew was a name in a newspaper column, and the only version Margaret knew, most days, was a letter arriving from Brussels. That's what the separation actually looked like. Once you strip away the constitutional language and the diplomatic posting, and the polite fiction that this was simply a career move. Townsend was living an ordinary life in an unfamiliar city, doing a job that mattered a great deal less to him than the one thing he couldn't do anymore, which was be in the same room as the woman he loved. Margaret was living her life in London, carrying out the public duties expected of a princess, and doing it all while the papers she wasn't supposed to read openly speculated about whether she'd ever see him again. They wrote to each other. That's the plain fact underneath all of it. Not dramatic, not headline material, just 2 people staying connected, the only way circumstance allowed them to. Letters took days to cross the channel. Visits, when they happened at all, had to be arranged quietly, and even then they never stayed quiet for long. This wasn't a romance being carried out in secret anymore. It hadn't been secret since that flick of the hand at the coronation. It was a romance being carried out in public, watched by a country that had already decided it had an opinion. And the country's opinion, as it turned out, wasn't what the palace expected. This is the part that tends to get lost in the tidier version of the story, the idea that Margaret stood entirely alone, up against an unmovable establishment with no one on her side. She wasn't alone, not in the way that's often told. As the months dragged on, ordinary people started writing letters of their own, not to Townsend, not to Margaret directly, but to newspapers, to members of Parliament, arguing that a war hero who'd been the wronged party in his own marriage shouldn't have his happiness held against him by an institution that claimed to value fairness. Sympathy for the couple ran surprisingly deep among the public, even as the establishment around them held its position without budging an inch. The press coverage only intensified with time, and it didn't intensify quietly. Contemporary newspapers reached for the one comparison big enough to match what they were watching unfold: the abdication of 1936, the last time this family had faced a decision this size, with this much of the public looking on. One paper at the time put it plainly, remarking that not since Edward VI gave up his throne had there been more intense national speculation about the future of a member of the royal family. That's not a small comparison to make. The abdication had ended a reign and reshaped the entire monarchy. And here, less than 2 decades later, editors were reaching for that same measuring stick to describe two people who simply wanted to get married. Underneath all that noise, there was a date circling on the calendar that mattered more than any headline. Margaret would turn 25 on the 21st of August, 1955. Under the Royal Marriages Act, that birthday changed everything about her legal position. Past 25, she wouldn't need her sister's consent to marry at all. She'd only need to give Parliament a year's notice, and if neither house formally objected within that year, the marriage could go ahead regardless of what the Queen personally thought about it. For the first time since Townsend had proposed, the decision was on a track that led somewhere concrete, on a timeline nobody in the family controlled, which meant every year that passed wasn't neutral. It wasn't simply time ticking by while two people waited patiently for permission. It was time moving Margaret steadily toward a point where permission, in the strict legal sense, would stop being required at all, and toward a moment where the question would finally have to be answered by someone, because the law itself was about to force the issue. That's what made the waiting so unbearable for everyone watching from outside it, and probably for the two people living through it as well. 2 years is a long time to sustain a relationship on letters and rationed visits. It's an even longer time to sustain public interest without it curdling into something else. Impatience, fatigue, the sense that a story without an ending simply needs to be given one, whether the people at the center of it are ready or not. By the summer of 1955, that patience, on every side, was running out. Margaret's birthday had come and gone. The legal clock the Royal Marriages Act had quietly been running now favored her more than it ever had before. Townsend's posting in Brussels was drawing toward its natural end, and a country that had spent 2 years reading tea leaves in every royal appearance, every raised eyebrow, every unconfirmed rumor about a reunion, was about to get the one thing it had been waiting for: an answer. But nobody, not the press speculating in print, not the public writing letters on the couple's behalf, not even the family standing closest to Margaret, actually knew what that answer was going to be. The choice, when it finally came, wouldn't belong to Parliament, or to the church, or to the newspapers that had spent 2 years deciding how the story ought to end. It would belong to one 25-year-old woman, walking back into London that October to see the man she'd been separated from for 2 years, with a decision in front of her that no one else was going to make for her this time. If you're still with me at this point, you already know this isn't the kind of story most channels bother getting right. If that matters to you, hit like and make sure you're subscribed. It's genuinely how a channel like this stays able to keep telling stories this way. In October of 1955, Peter Townsend's posting in Brussels came to an end, and he flew home to London. What was waiting for him wasn't just Margaret. It was a plan, drafted, argued over, and quietly filed away, that almost no one in Britain would know existed for another 50 years. By this point, the man in Downing Street wasn't Churchill anymore. Anthony Eden had taken over as Prime Minister that April, inheriting a problem his predecessor had spent 2 years managing without ever quite solving. And in the weeks before Townsend's return, Eden's government sat down with the Queen and did something the public version of this story has never made room for. They worked out a way it could actually happen. 3 separate drafts of a document survive from that process, filed under the plain bureaucratic title, Summary of Procedure. Under the plan they laid out, Margaret could marry Peter Townsend. She would keep her royal title. She would keep her place in public life, continuing her duties if the public response allowed for it, which every indication at the time suggested it would. She would even keep her income from the civil list, £6,000 a year, with an additional £9,000 granted on marriage itself. The price wasn't her happiness. The price was her place, and her children's place, in the line of succession. Renounce that, and the rest of it, the title, the income, the life she already knew, could stay intact. That plan existed, on paper, with a prime minister's signature behind it and a queen's approval attached. It sat in government files at Whitehall, then eventually made its way into the National Archives at Kew, where it remained sealed for decades under the standard closure rules governing sensitive royal correspondence. It wasn't declassified and made available to historians and the public until 2004, nearly half a century after it was written, long after most of the people involved were dead, and long after the public had already settled on a much simpler version of what had happened. That's the gap worth sitting with directly. For 70 years, the story told about this moment has been an impossible choice. The crown on one side, love on the other, with no middle ground for a young woman caught between them. That's not what the documents show. The government the public believed was standing in Margaret's way had, in fact, built her a door. It was there. It was real. It came with conditions, certainly. No one was offering her the throne and Townsend both, but it was a door, not a wall, and the only person who could decide whether to walk through it was Margaret herself. Which brings the story back to that October, and to the reunion everyone had spent 2 years waiting for. Margaret had written to Eden herself, months before Townsend's return, and told him something that doesn't fit neatly into the fairy tale version either. She said she couldn't properly decide anything until she'd actually seen Townsend again, face to face, after 2 years apart. Not a declaration of certainty, not a woman who'd already made peace with giving him up, quietly performing a decision for the cameras. A woman telling her own prime minister, in writing, that she genuinely didn't know yet. So when Townsend landed back in London that October, what followed wasn't a formality. It was the actual reunion the entire compromise had been built around. Two people who hadn't stood in the same room in 2 years, meeting again with a real, workable path to a life together sitting on the table in front of them, waiting only for one of them to reach for it. Here's where the honest version of this story has to stay honest, rather than settle for whichever ending feels more satisfying. There are 2 ways to read what happened next, and the evidence doesn't clearly favor either one. One reading says, Margaret walked into that reunion already leaning away from the marriage. That 2 years of separation, of watching the toll this had taken on her family and on Townsend himself, had quietly worn down her resolve long before October. And the letter to Eden was less genuine uncertainty than the last polite formality before a decision she'd already half made. The other reading says the opposite, that she meant exactly what she wrote, that she was still, genuinely weighing a real choice, right up until the moment she actually saw him again, and that whatever happened between them in those few days in October is the only thing that actually tipped the scale. Nobody outside that room will ever know which of those is true. Christopher Warwick, the biographer she herself worked with and trusted with her story, has gone on record saying the archive material complicates the picture more than it clarifies it. The letter doesn't hand us her answer. It only proves the question was still open longer than anyone was ever told. What isn't in dispute is the timeline of what came next, and how fast it moved once it started. The final draft of the summary of procedure, the government's carefully worked out compromise, the plan that would have let Margaret keep almost everything except her place in the succession, was completed just 3 days before the public got its answer. 3 days. After 2 years of separation, after a government's worth of drafting and negotiation, after a prime minister and a queen had quietly built a bridge nobody in Britain knew was there. And in those 3 days, Margaret was about to say something that made every page of that plan irrelevant. On the morning of October 31st, 1955, a single sentence, drafted in Margaret's own name, brought a 2-year national obsession to an end, before most of the country had even finished breakfast. It came out through the BBC, read aloud so the entire nation could hear it in something close to real time, and printed in full in every newspaper that had spent 2 years speculating about exactly this moment. The wording had been worked over carefully. This wasn't a hasty statement dashed off in the heat of a decision. It was a document built to carry enormous weight in very few words, and it did exactly what it was built to do. Margaret announced that she would not marry Peter Townsend. She acknowledged, plainly, that a civil marriage would have been possible if she renounced her rights of succession, the exact path the government's own compromise, finished only 3 days earlier, had been built to make workable. She invoked the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, tying her decision explicitly to doctrine rather than politics or family pressure. And she said something that would end up defining how this entire moment gets remembered, that she had reached the decision entirely alone. 4 words that did an enormous amount of work. Entirely alone meant no one had forced her hand. Not the church, not the government, not her sister sitting on the throne she'd never inherit. It meant this was hers, her judgment, her conscience, her sacrifice, offered up without anyone standing behind her holding a pen to her hand. It's the phrase that turned a young woman's private heartbreak into a public act of duty the entire country could admire without reservation, because there was no villain in the story for anyone to be angry at. Just a princess making a hard choice on her own terms. The country responded almost immediately and almost entirely in her favor. The Portadown News, printing its coverage days later, called it exactly what so much of the press was calling it that week, a courageous decision. The paper framed her as a young woman who, out of respect for the church's teaching and her duty to the Commonwealth, had chosen to set aside her own happiness for a man who, through no fault of his own, had ended up on the wrong side of the divorce courts. It's a striking piece of phrasing, because it manages to praise Margaret and defend Townsend in the same sentence, treating both of them as sympathetic figures caught inside a situation neither one had asked for. And once again, the newspapers of the day reached for the same comparison they'd been reaching for since the coronation. Not since the abdication, one paper wrote, had there been this much intense national speculation about the future of a member of the royal family. 19 years earlier, that comparison had described a king walking away from his throne. Now it described a princess walking away from the man she loved instead. Different ending, same magnitude, in the eyes of the people watching it unfold in real time. For most of Britain, that was where the story stopped. The statement had done its job. It gave the public a clean, satisfying resolution, duty triumphing over desire, delivered in a handful of solemn, dignified sentences, with no one left to blame and no loose threads left hanging. The nation could admire Margaret, sympathize with Townsend, and move on, confident it understood exactly what had happened and why. Except that isn't quite what the archives eventually showed. Christopher Warwick, the biographer Margaret herself worked with, the one person outside her closest circle who had genuine access to how she actually thought about this period of her life, has been careful in the years since not to let the tidy public version stand unchallenged. He said plainly that the accepted story, the one built almost entirely around that phrase, entirely alone, and the picture of a woman calmly choosing duty over love, doesn't fully square with what the documents from 1955 actually reveal. There was a plan. There was a door that had genuinely been built for her. The public was never told any of that at the time, and by the time it came to light decades later, the simpler version had already hardened into the accepted history nearly everyone believed. That doesn't mean the statement was dishonest. It means it was incomplete, not through any deception on Margaret's part, but because the full picture behind it was never something the public was given the chance to see. What the country got was the ending. What it didn't get was everything that had been quietly offered and quietly declined in the days just before it. For Margaret, in the immediate aftermath, the reaction was almost entirely sympathetic, almost entirely kind. She'd handled an impossible situation with a grace that impressed even the papers that had spent 2 years feeding on every scrap of the story. Whatever she was feeling privately, in public she'd given the country exactly the ending it wanted to believe in. For Peter Townsend, the reaction looked very different, because there was no reaction reserved for him at all. He wasn't the one who'd issued a statement. He wasn't the one being praised in print for courage and sacrifice. He was simply the man the princess had decided not to marry, a footnote in his own story, watching from the sidelines while an entire nation processed a decision that had ended his engagement without ever really asking how it had ended his life. The country believed, that afternoon, that the story was finished, a clean resolution, a dignified statement, a princess who'd chosen her duty and would now move forward with her head held high. For Peter Townsend, it wasn't finished at all. It was only just beginning to cost him something the public statement never once mentioned, and the price was about to be higher than anyone watching from outside his life could have guessed. Peter Townsend never gave an interview blaming anyone, not the church, not the government. Not even Margaret. For more than 20 years after that October, he simply didn't talk about it in public at all. In 1978, in a memoir called Time and Chance, he finally explained why, and what the silence had actually been holding back. The book itself is a strange kind of document. Most of it is exactly what you'd expect from a man like Townsend, measured, understated, more interested in describing the people he served and the work he did than in settling scores. But running underneath all of it is an honest account of what those 8 years actually did to him. Reviewers who've read it closely describe it plainly. The relationship with Margaret cost him his marriage, cost him his career in royal service, and reshaped the entire direction of the rest of his life. Not metaphorically, literally. He went from a decorated war pilot on a clear path inside the royal household to a man rebuilding an ordinary life from scratch, in a country that wasn't his own, because of a romance the establishment had decided couldn't be allowed to happen. What makes the book worth pausing on isn't the bitterness, because there isn't much of it. It's the honesty about scale. Townsend wrote that Margaret could only have married him by giving up everything, her position, her prestige, her privy purse. And then, without any self-pity in the way he put it, he admitted something most men in his position would never have said out loud. He didn't believe he'd had the weight, as he put it, to counterbalance everything she would have lost by choosing him. Sit with that for a second, because it's not a small thing to write about yourself. He wasn't saying the church stopped them. He wasn't saying the government stopped them. He was saying in his own words 23 years later that he genuinely didn't think he was worth what it would have cost her to keep him. Whether that was true or not is beside the point. It's what he believed, and it's what he lived with. He didn't spend those years in public misery either. After Brussels, Townsend settled into a life that looked, from the outside, almost deliberately quiet. A life built as far away from headlines as a man who'd once been the subject of international ones could manage to get. He eventually moved to France, married again, and became, by most accounts, genuinely content in a way the tabloids that once hounded him never seemed especially interested in reporting. In 1959, 4 years after the statement that ended his engagement, Townsend married a 19-year-old Belgian woman named Marie-Luce Jamagne, who'd been working as his secretary. The age gap between them was almost identical to the one that had scandalized Britain when it ran the other direction, between him and Margaret, a detail history has mostly declined to comment on. This time there was no Church of England standing in the way, no Royal Marriages Act, no newspapers staking out the wedding. Just a quiet ceremony and the start of a marriage that, by every account that survives, lasted the rest of his life. He wrote to Margaret himself before the announcement became public, by most accounts a gesture of basic decency between two people who'd once meant everything to each other and still, in whatever complicated way, respected one another enough to not let the news arrive secondhand. It's a small detail, easy to skip past, but it says something about the kind of man he was. Even in moving on, he made sure she didn't find out from a stranger. While Townsend was quietly building that second life abroad, Margaret was still in London, still 29 years old, still very much a public figure, with an entire country watching to see what she'd do next. The man who'd cost her so much, by her own account, was settling into contentment on the other side of the channel. She was about to try something very different, not another quiet romance built slowly out of years of proximity, but a fast, public, glamorous courtship with a man who couldn't have been less like Peter Townsend if she'd designed him that way on purpose. Chapter 9. The wedding that was supposed to prove something. 5 years after giving up one man for duty, Margaret chose another man entirely for herself, and Britain, watching from the outside, treated it like the fairy tale ending the first story never got to have. His name was Anthony Armstrong Jones, and on paper he was almost the exact opposite of Peter Townsend in every way that mattered. Where Townsend was an RAF officer, steady and formal, a man who'd spent his career inside the structure of royal service, Armstrong Jones was a working photographer, sharp, stylish, moving in the same fashionable, faintly bohemian London circles that Margaret herself had increasingly gravitated toward in the years since 1955. He wasn't part of the establishment, he photographed it. That difference, more than anything else, seemed to be exactly the appeal. They met at a dinner party hosted by one of Margaret's friends in the late 1950s, and whatever spark existed between them was kept remarkably well hidden for a couple who would go on to marry in front of the entire watching world. Unlike the Townsend relationship, which had been public property from the moment that camera caught a flick of the hand at the coronation, this courtship stayed almost entirely out of the papers until the two of them were ready to announce it themselves. That announcement came on the 26th of February 1960, just 1 week after the birth of Margaret's nephew, Prince Andrew, in a year already crowded with royal news, and it moved fast. Less than 3 months after the engagement became public, on the 6th of May 1960, Margaret and Anthony Armstrong Jones were married at Westminster Abbey, in a ceremony broadcast live on television for the very first time in royal wedding history. The same milestone the coronation had claimed 7 years earlier, now handed to a princess's wedding instead. The scale of it was enormous. More than 2,000 guests packed into the abbey. Prince Philip himself escorted Margaret down the aisle, in the absence of the father who died 8 years earlier. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Geoffrey Fisher, presided over the ceremony, the same archbishop who had married Elizabeth and Philip back in 1947, a detail that quietly tied this wedding back to the last great royal celebration the country had witnessed, as if the family were determined to prove that joy, not just duty, still belonged to them. For a country that had spent the better part of a decade watching Margaret give something up, this felt like restitution. Here, finally, was the ending everyone had wanted for her the first time around. A wedding, a husband of her own choosing, a fresh start built entirely on her own terms, with no act of parliament and no church doctrine standing between her and the man at the altar. The papers that had once framed her as a princess nobly sacrificing her happiness now got to frame her as a princess claiming it back. Children followed quickly. Their son David was born in November of 1961. Their daughter Sarah arrived in May of 1964. On the surface, everything about the marriage read exactly the way the public wanted it to. Proof that the woman who'd chosen duty over love once had finally, belatedly, gotten to choose love for herself. But a wedding that big, built that fast, in front of that many cameras, carries its own kind of weight. It wasn't just a marriage. It was a story the entire country needed to be true. The happy sequel to a sad first chapter. The proof that everything had worked out the way it was supposed to. And stories that the public needs to be true have a way of not asking too many hard questions while the cameras are still rolling. The marriage that was supposed to be the opposite of sacrifice, free, chosen, entirely her own, was about to become its own kind of cost. It just wouldn't show its true shape for a few more years yet. By the late 1960s, rumors of a rift inside the marriage everyone had once called royalty's golden couple had already started circulating, and neither Margaret nor her husband worked especially hard to deny them. It's worth remembering just how bright that early period had looked from the outside. Christopher Warwick, who spent years studying the marriage as closely as anyone outside it ever could, has described those first years in terms that leave no room for ambiguity. A couple whose parties at Kensington Palace became the stuff of legend. An invitation into what he's called royalty's golden couple. The kind of glittering, star-studded world that made an evening with them feel like breathing rarefied air. That's not a small thing to build a reputation on. For most of the decade, Margaret and Anthony Armstrong-Jones weren't just married. They were, by most measures, the most glamorous couple the monarchy had produced in a generation. Underneath that surface, something had already started to give. The specifics of what went wrong between them have never been fully agreed upon, even by the people who knew them best, which is, in its own way, the most honest thing that can be said about it. What isn't disputed is the pattern that emerged through the 1970s. Both of them, by multiple accounts, had affairs. Neither seemed especially inclined to hide it particularly well. A marriage that had once been performed for the cameras as effortlessly happy was, by the middle of the decade, being performed for those same cameras as something considerably more strained. In 1973, Margaret met a man named Roddy Llewellyn, 17 years her junior, working at the time as a gardener, with none of the polish or public profile Armstrong-Jones had built his early reputation on. What began between them developed slowly, quietly, in the way most of Margaret's relationships tended to, before the press got hold of them. This one didn't stay quiet for long either. In 1976, photographs surfaced of Margaret and Llewellyn together on the island of Mustique, where she'd owned a home for years, images that left very little room for the kind of ambiguous denial the palace had leaned on decades earlier over Peter Townsend. There was no fluff to brush from a uniform this time, no single ambiguous gesture a defender could explain away. There were photographs, printed and circulated, of a married princess with a much younger man, on a beach, a world away from Kensington Palace and the marriage the public had spent over a decade believing in. That March, Margaret and Armstrong-Jones separated. The formal divorce took 2 more years to complete. On the 11th of July 1978, it was finalized, and with it, Margaret became something no member of the British royal family's immediate circle had been in more than 4 centuries. Her marriage to Anthony Armstrong-Jones was the first divorce inside the monarch's immediate family since 1540, when Henry the Fecid had his brief marriage to Anne of Cleves annulled. 438 years of unbroken precedent, ended by the same woman who, 23 years earlier, had told the entire country she'd chosen duty over love, specifically because the institution she belonged to didn't allow for exactly this outcome. It's hard not to notice the shape of that. In 1955, Margaret gave up the man she loved in large part because divorce, and the remarriage of a divorced man, sat outside what the church and the crown were willing to accept. By 1978, she'd become the very thing that entire sacrifice had been designed to prevent her family from being associated with, a royal divorcee, the first in generations, with her own name now permanently attached to precisely the kind of scandal she'd once been asked to protect the family from. None of that makes the two situations identical. Townsend's divorce had been someone else's fault, in a courtroom that assigned blame the way divorce law required at the time. Margaret's second marriage simply came apart on its own, through years of drift and infidelity on both sides, the way plenty of marriages do without any institution needing to intervene at all. But the echo is hard to miss all the same. A woman who once sacrificed a relationship to protect an ideal of royal marriage, watching her own marriage become the thing that finally cracked that ideal open for everyone who came after her. So it's worth asking the question directly, rather than letting the story answer it for you. Margaret gave up Peter Townsend in 1955 because she believed, or said she believed, that duty mattered more than love. In 1960, she chose a marriage entirely on her own terms, no act of parliament, no church doctrine, nothing standing between her and the man she wanted. And by 1978, that marriage too was over, ending in exactly the kind of scandal her earlier sacrifice had been meant to spare her family from. Did the woman who once chose duty over love ever actually get the version of love she chose instead? Or did she spend the rest of her life discovering that the version she'd given up and the version she'd chosen were both, in their own ways, impossible to hold on to? Go back, one more time, to Westminster Abbey, the 2nd of June, 1953. A young woman reaches out, without thinking, and brushes a piece of fluff from the uniform of a man standing beside her. At the time, it meant nothing to either of them. By the end of this story, it meant almost everything. That's the strange power of a gesture like that. It doesn't know in the moment it happens what it's about to cost. Margaret didn't choose that moment. She didn't weigh it, didn't debate it, didn't decide anything at all. Her hand simply moved the way it would move for anyone she trusted completely, and by the time anyone told her what that movement had set off, the story was already being written by people who'd never asked her permission. That's worth holding on to, all these decades later, because so much of what came after gets remembered as a series of deliberate choices. A young princess weighing love against duty, carefully, consciously, and landing on duty because that's who she was raised to be. But the truth this story has tried to hold on to, honestly, is messier than that. The gesture that started everything wasn't a choice at all, and the choice that ended it, the one delivered in a statement on the 31st of October 1955, came from a woman who, by her own hand, in a letter to a prime minister 2 months earlier, admitted she still didn't fully know her own answer. Margaret spent the rest of her life carrying both of those truths at once. The public one, familiar to nearly everyone who's ever heard her name, a princess who nobly gave up love for duty, then went on to build a full, complicated, occasionally scandalous life of her own. And the private one, only visible now, decades later, in an archive most people will never visit. A woman who was never entirely certain the sacrifice she made was as clean as the story built around it. Her health began failing badly in the final years of the 1990s, a slow accumulation of strokes and declining strength that gradually took away much of the independence she'd spent a lifetime insisting on. She died in February of 2002, at the age of 71, just days before what would have been the 50th anniversary of her father's death. The same loss, half a century earlier, that had first pulled Peter Townsend into her orbit as something more than a family friend. It's the kind of detail that feels almost too neatly built for a story to be entirely coincidental, and yet it is exactly what happened, verified by the historical record rather than invented for effect. George Carey, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, has said publicly that he visited Margaret shortly before she died. This part of the story deserves to be told honestly as what it is. His account, given years later in a television documentary, not a document from the archives themselves, and it should be heard that way. By his recollection, she was sad in those final days, carrying a sorrow that surfaced in quiet moments rather than dramatic ones. Carey has described her, in his own words, as a woman who'd longed for love and commitment her whole life, and who'd had the love of her life taken from her by forces entirely outside her control. Whether that sorrow was really about Peter Townsend specifically, or about the shape her whole life had taken because of the choice she made at 25, is something no one left alive can answer with certainty. What's documented, at least, is how Margaret herself described her closest relationship, the one with her sister, the one that had shaped every major decision of her life since childhood. She once said that in her family, disagreements never really lasted, that they'd have a jolly good row and then it's all over, and that in her whole life, she and Elizabeth had only truly fallen out twice. Whatever the cost of the choices Margaret made, that bond, at least, never seems to have been part of the price. So return, one final time, to that moment in the Abbey, the flick of a hand, half a second long, meant for no one but a man she trusted. Before she'd made a single conscious choice about anything that followed, that gesture had already started deciding things for her. The proposal, the posting to Brussels, the 2 years of letters. The statement that made her, for the rest of her life, the woman who chose duty over love. All of it traces back to something she never actually decided to do. Picture her instead the way the people who loved her actually remember her. Not frail, not declining, not any of the images that tend to close out stories like this one. Picture her at a party sometime in the middle of it all, glass in hand, laughing at something no one else in the room found quite as funny as she did, entirely herself, contradictions and all, unbothered by which version of her story the country had decided to believe that particular year. So here's the question worth sitting with, now that you know what the archives actually say. Do you believe it really was duty over love, a clean, deliberate sacrifice, exactly the way it's been told for 70 years? Or does that letter, sitting in her own handwriting at Kew, change what you thought you knew? There's another piece of this story still waiting to be told. What actually became of the man who once wrote that he hadn't the weight to counterbalance everything Margaret would have lost? His second life, quietly built an ocean away from all of this, might be the most surprising part of the whole story. If this is the kind of story you want more of, told properly, with the facts and the respect it deserves, subscribe now so the next one finds you. And if you know someone who still thinks they know exactly how this story ends, send them this one.